Dear viewers, thank you once again for joining us on Muslim Youth Matters, the podcast where we're meeting with a number of experts and voices from the community to try to better understand the issues and challenges that the youth of our Muslim community face. And today's episode, we have a guest who is, I think, very well known in the community for his poetic and artistic talents, but who can also bring a very valuable insight because of his personal experience and because of his professional background to help us understand some of those challenges that the youth face. Uh, Jamaal Jackson Rogers, thank you so much for being with us and taking the time today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. Wonderful setup here. The vibe is beautiful, so I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Beautiful. So let's get started with trying to uh, simply understand who you are, a little bit of your journey, and eventually what got you involved in being exposed to the issues that the youth are facing, and this kind of work.
So my name is Jamal Rogers on government paper, but Jamal Jackson Rogers. The Jackson was added about let's say 2012 when my mother passed away, Joanne Jackson. And there was a of moment of enlightenment because at that moment is when I found out about my history. So to tell you about who I am, I
Mhm,
probably have to introduce you to a little bit of my history. I didn't know my mother's side of the family,
mhm.
and as Black people here in North America, many of us don't know our roots past maybe our grandparents or great grandparents, and same situation with me. And so when my mom passed away and I got to know her side of the family, it turns out that I have ancestry and legacy that, to be honest, blew my mind. Found out that my great 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 grandfather was Canada's first black postman through having to have a dialogue and a sit down with Canada's first prime minister at the time. And my great grandfather's family escaped slavery with his mom and his six siblings from Delaware in the United
Wow.
States. I didn't know this story, and actually, my family on my mom's side didn't know this story. It was a white woman that brought that story to us and unveiled a whole legacy. And
Mhm.
so, a lot of who I am is still trying to be uncovered as a human being, and that's related to my legacy and my ancestors. But today, I can tell you that I'm a poet, a father of six children, married for almost 20 years this year, inshallah. And yes, I'm a black, visibly black person. I'm a Muslim as my spiritual practice, and I'm a creative and artist and entrepreneur in the city of Ottawa.
So thank you very much for sharing these personal start beginning of your personal roots with us. Let's get into a little bit of kind of your personal journey
Mm.
and how it got you involved with working with the youth.
Mhm,
Why
mhm.
are you interested in talking and being active in this sphere?
So I was born in Toronto. My father raised me in Guyana, his home country, South
Mhm.
America, and then we came back to Toronto and then settled here in Ottawa eventually. So I've been here for quite a long time. I consider Ottawa my home more so than Guyana and Toronto. And when I was young, I remember asking my dad, I want a job because I wanted to buy things. I want the video game sets and such. He said, get a job. So I said, I don't know how to get a job. He taught me how to build a resume, taught me how to do an interview. And he said, go to your local community center or community sports center and just say what jobs are there. So I went to Pinecrest Swimming Pool Recreation Center
Mhm.
and I said, I'd like to have a job. And they said, oh, maybe you could be a junior camp counselor for our summer camp. And I have so many siblings. I grew up amongst five siblings,
Mhm.
and I was always the one babysitting everybody. So I was like, I could do this,
Mhm.
and I decided to apply for the job. Unfortunately, my first year I could only volunteer. I was only 14, but then the next year they hired me, and so that's where my passion for working with youth came because I from that moment in those summers. Spent 3, 4 summers doing summer camps, just connecting with youth, listening to them, bringing out that joyful spirit, that innocence, and that essence of just big imaginations, and helping to nurture them in that way. I really could connect with that.
Mhm.
It felt like it was just very natural to me, and that's where my journey began working with youth. And I think all throughout my life, there were signs pointing to me towards this career that I've created for myself. I have a nephew who's autistic, and I used to take care of him. And as I started to approach post secondary, deciding what I wanted to study, I realized I wanted to learn about learning disabilities or children with different learning
Mhm.
abilities.
Mhm.
So I dived into that. I did a post secondary degree in developmental services. I did another post secondary degree in child studies, and did another post secondary degree in early childhood education. And it just broadened my understanding of child and youth development,
Mhm.
and it helped me to now even connect with youth even further. I felt like I always had this affinity and way of being able to tell stories, make young people laugh, make them feel comfortable and safe. And then when I started to learn about child development and the psychology behind it, now it's like, okay, well, I can really help some of the most difficult young people that I work with. And I think because of my ability to connect with different people, no matter their paths and walks of life, is how I ended up navigating so many different spaces, like working in juvenile detention centers, working in schools that are wealthy, like upper class, and creating my own after school programs. Just from the list from A to Z of which groups of youth that I've worked with, I feel like I've worked with them all. I've even worked in an all girls school, which I
Mhm.
thought I was totally out of place, and they could have had a woman for it, but they really wanted me, and I've even worked in an all girls school before. So
That's excellent, and it gives us so much to explore and talk about. Um, Based on this experience, so coming at it both from a personal perspective as
yeah.
well as a more professional background, and given the theme that we're trying to explore, if you had to kind of say, here are two, three top issues that are urgent and
Mm,
important and need to be explored and unpacked and dealt with,
mm, mm.
what are some of those to you?
I would say one of the first is a sense of identity and belonging
Hmm.
with young people.
Yeah.
Uh, th- uh, and each one of these I can relate exactly to, because I've been through these circumstances, and I worked in communities that experienced these issues. But definitely a sense of belonging and identity. Another one would be outreach. How well do the communities of these youth that how well do the communities that the youth grow up in reach out to their external communities, but
Hmm.
also how well do the external communities invite and reach out to these new communities that are living amongst them. And then I'd say the third issue that I could speak to, and I love thinking about and crafting my ideas around, is discrimination, and how discrimination creates walls and barriers, and therefore also fosters isolation and lack of access. It creates it's a system, it's systemic essentially, right? It creates a roller coaster and a snowball effect of other issues. So discrimination and being othered and singled out is definitely something I could speak to, considering that I'm part of like I'm a what do I call it? A marginalized within a marginalized within a marginalized community type thing. So
So let's start with the first one. You
yeah.
you mentioned the sense of identity and belonging. And for all of them, I'm not going to push you too much there, but
Mhm,
because
mhm.
you did say you identify personally with each of these, you have gone through it yourself.
Yes,
So
yes.
I let you draw on whether you want to go personal, you want to go
Mm,
through,
mm.
your studies and your professional experience.
Ouais.
Uh, let's unpack that. The
Yeah.
sense of identity and belonging. How does it manifest itself? How do you encounter it and recognize it? And then we'll talk about how do you deal with
How do you
all
deal
of
with it?
this.
Well, I think the thing that stands out to me the most when it comes to a sense of identity is representation. If you are a newcomer, or if you don't have roots in a cultural collective for a good amount of time, then what might end up happening is, you, even psychologically, you yourself will see and understand and notice the difference. For example, when I was in Guyana, I didn't know what poverty was.
Mhm.
and I didn't know what blackness was versus whiteness. I didn't know that I was considered a specific color of a specific ethnic group or race, as they call it, which is obviously a fallacy, right? The idea of race. But
Or
when I
even a
came,
socioeconomic class, as you're saying,
exactly,
poverty.
even a
Yeah.
socio, everybody around me in my community, we lived the same. This is how we were. This is all I knew.
Mhm.
When I came to Canada and I saw the disparity, that's when I started to understand, what poverty is. I grew up in poverty. I didn't know that I was part of this demographic of people that were considered low
Mhm.
economic or low class and whatnot. And so that became apparent to me. And then also my blackness became apparent to me. Although of course, growing up in Guyana, I knew there are people of different color. I didn't know we were so compartmentalized in a way, right? I didn't know that the world was like that.
Mhm.
And then when I came here, I realized, wow, things are quite compartmentalized. This is not what I expected. And it's the same thing within identity and communities that are trying to grow their roots. Their roots are still fresh and new, right? In its infancy stage. If you don't see representation of the things that relate to you culturally,
Mhm.
you're going to just from a psychological standpoint and a human development standpoint, you're going to feel isolated, and you're going to feel like your sense of belonging is not as rich and valuable as others who have long-term roots here. So part of it is natural. Part of that experience is natural, although society does unfortunately create and kind of like push that narrative forward through the way we live and operate. So for example, we have a sense of identity. If there are countries that are for immigration, Canada is for immigration. It's been that way for a very long time. We're pro-immigration,
Mhm.
essentially, right? If there and we know that Canada is pro-immigration because this is part of the way their economy works, right? Without Canada's pro-immigration policy, Canada's economy will not be as bolstered and flourishing as it is. So in the case of what we call sorry, not immigration, in the case of a pro-immigration stance, right? You have citizens that are arriving continuously, and so you have a constant flux, right? Growing flux
Mhm.
of communities trying to identify. But then you have communities that have been here for a while. Somali community, they've been here now for since I'd say about 35 to 40 years. Actually, probably a little longer than that. Their influx began about 40 years ago,
Mhm.
and now we see from the struggles they've had, if you've been in Ottawa long enough, you see from the struggles they've had and the curve, it's like a learning curve, the curve they've had to overcome. And now you can see families settling in now.
Mhm.
So there's a time factor here. But unfortunately, when you have people who are claiming that, foreign is not what we, appreciate, is not what we need, society now starts to create these divisions
Mhm.
where you can actually feel othered, not because of the natural process of assimilation. You feel othered because people are actually putting you in a box,
Mhm.
and that takes away from your civil liberties. The moment you start to feel that your existence is trapped in a box
Mhm.
that has a definition that wasn't created by you, right? That definition of that box is not created by you, and it's not your identity. It's
Right.
someone's labeling you and saying this is what your identity is.
Mhm.
And then you're trying, and all you're trying to do is understand. That's all new first generation immigrants and such are trying to do. They're trying to understand, right? That's what you do anywhere you go, right? When you walk into a new shopping center, a mall,
Mhm.
and the signs look different and you're not used to it, first thing you start doing is you're trying to understand that world, this new world. Oh, I don't shop at this place, let me figure it out.
Mhm.
That's what new families, first generation families are trying to do.
Mhm.
Understand, but then you have some unfortunate parts of societal concepts that squelch that understanding and
Mhm.
tell you this is where you need to be.
Mhm.
So I think in regards to identity and belonging, it's a lot of social constructs that make this up. But at the same time, one of the biggest things is when human beings are taking the opposite side of that social construct and saying, well, we need to compartmentalize you because that's the only way we'll understand you.
Mhm.
Which essentially, I can get to the solution. You need dialogue. You need inter-dialogue exchange from the get-go. We should not be bringing in newcomers,
Mhm.
and there are no systems that create immediately inter dialogue. And I know there's the library, the human library exchange, and not exchange, but the human library
Program.
program.
Yeah.
That's right. That happens. But there's got to be on the institutional level, programs
Mhm.
and initiatives that create that exchange for families, for newcomers right away. This way, we have less time to start biasing and judging and compartmentalizing and saying you're categorized now as the Syrian escapee of civil war. That's what you are. No.
And you'll always be
And
that, and
you'll
that's it.
and when I see you move to the suburbs, you're still the Syrian family that came and from civil war.
Mhm.
When people are carrying much more relevancy to their existence and their history and their stories than just that one, thing that
Label.
label exactly, right? So we can get it. We can snowball, like I said, it's a
Of
snowball thing,
course.
right? But media has a lot to do with that. Ignorance has a lot to do with that, and control has a lot to do with that.
Let me segue from there to the second, because I think there is definitely, and you started touching on that, the second point you identified, which is the outreach.
Yeah,
So let's unpack that a little bit. So you said the outreach and the back and forth between the communities, and you started talking about that.
yeah,
So you identified that as an issue and something that we need to look at in terms of the challenges that the youth are facing.
that's right.
So in what way is it an issue?
So I would say there's two sides to that coin, right? This outreach topic. The first side I talk about is communities that have newcomers in or within as residents and citizens. These communities, it's like you're traveling to a new world. So when you
Mhm.
come, you're in a new world essentially, and that learning curve, as I mentioned, there's no specific time. Some families could take 2-3 years before they let go of some of the things they're leaving behind, right? Some families continue to live with some of the things that they've left behind for another 25 years because they have family members there, most of their families there. And others might be a much faster transition. So in regards to outreach from the newcomers and how they reach into the community, what tends to happen is families are protective. They've learned that in order to survive, we must be hyper protective of our traditions, our
Mhm.
cultures, especially if we're going somewhere new, especially if they've had more than one transition to different areas of the world. A lot of times when people in Canada or in like the Western part of the world, they see a family come from another part of the world as immigrants or refugees, they think that they only came from that one place. What they don't realize is in the last 2 years, they've went from one spot to another spot to another spot,
Mhm.
trying to find their liberation and trying to settle. Right. And that's very, very common.
Mhm.
But we don't see it here when we're growing up here. We think, oh, you just came from, Rwanda, right? That's where you came from. No, there are a whole bunch of other camps before they reached here. So in that sense, when they arrive here, they're hyper protective because they've had to
Mhm.
go from space to space, holding on to their truest ethics and morals and values and practices,
Mhm.
hoping that when they do settle, there's something left of what they who they are, right? And it's not just, well, let's adapt to survive, let's adapt to get by. And in that, the issue, and that's healthy, that's actually very healthy and necessary. It should be fostered, in fact,
Mhm.
which is something that our federal government doesn't do enough. Foster the protection of people's traditions when they come here, right? So that there's no conflict and war. But we could talk about internal conflict and war,
Mhm.
about assimilating versus sticking towards what they know and understand. But when they arrive, right, this idea now of nurturing and protecting that, it's so strong and it's like welded in armor that the downside of that mentality is that you don't get a chance to now breathe and experience the other side.
Mhm. Open
What
up.
and open up, it's closed off.
Mhm.
And in fact, I'm I'm like that. Even though that I'm born in Toronto, I'm like that when it comes to being black and talking to my children about the importance of loving yourself as a melanated person, not through obviously a sense of ego, but just loving and appreciating who you are. And sometimes I get like a little too like I don't think it's bad, but I get a little too Malcolm X with my kids. I'm just like, you got to understand the brilliance of being who you are. And but then I realized that's a little too tight because it's not just about that. It's not
Mhm.
just about the color of my skin and the history of that. It's more than that. Human beings are complex, sentient beings, right? So we can't just be, circle things and put a dot in and say that's it. Sometimes are targeted, and so I feel like that mentality, if we understood from a psychological standpoint, this is where probably doctors of psychology would help in these type of initiatives. If we understand that families are coming here and squeezing tight, right? They're in most cases, some are just ready to, they've already let go, but
Mhm.
in their own home country, they're just like, I'm out. I don't like this dictatorship, or this is too much. When I get to these other places, I'm embracing it all together. But for the majority of the time, these families are holding on to the tethers of what's left from their cultural identity, and that hinders them now from the outreach.
Yeah.
There's fear, right? There's fear of now trying of other human beings not understanding them, other human beings being discriminatory towards them, or other human beings just quick to, like, what's it called, push them to the side, it's neglect them, right? And it's not the case. It's not generally the case. Generally, people in professions do want to help,
Mhm.
especially in helping professions. They do want to help. And so if we can work with newcomers, and helping them understand that, what, your practices as a traditional this or traditional wherever you came from, it's safe to be that here, to be that way here. But also, when you're stepping into a new game, right, you also have to understand the rules of this new game too, in order for it to be safe for you as well.
Mhm.
And you meet in, you ever seen those diagrams where there's like three circles, one, and then there's one in the center, and there's another one? You meet in the nexus where
Mhm.
they
Mhm.
cross over.
There's something common.
Exactly. When you can meet in the nexus, right, between your, practices, beliefs, identity, and the cultural practices and understandings of this new space. When you can meet in that nexus, is what we call as harmony. That's harmony there, right? That's unity. Essentially,
Mhm.
that's what unity is. So outreach is so vital on our side, and I say our side because I do it. I'm a first generation immigrant,
Mhm.
right? Outreach is so important, from as early as possible. Now, from the other standpoint, the communities who have roots here, and they're experiencing or seeing youth come into their neighborhoods, come into their schools, right? And they're feeling a sense of, maybe they're feeling a sense of, a loss of, no, a loss of, maybe on their side, they're feeling like something that they protect is also being watered down
Yeah,
as well,
yeah.
right?
Diluted.
Diluted, that's the word, right? They're feeling like their sense of cultural identity is being diluted. What their task is to, um they need to be exposed. It's about awareness,
Mhm.
right? And everybody knows, just like, look at the concept of science. Science means that you must explore every crevice of information and evidence to arrive at the answer that you're looking for. You cannot say, that's not important. You have to explore it.
Yeah, face value is not enough. Yeah.
It's just not enough, right? And I think human beings, although we're innately we're scientific creatures, we forget that part of learning about each other and exposure to each other is vital for our survival. It's vital. So it's how we've been here this long, and
Yeah.
in reality, we haven't even been here long, right? So in allowing ourselves to be exposed and become aware of different cultural practices, identities, will help us to invite and do some outreach as well. When I moved out into the country, um, and I live amongst all white people. We're the only black family out there, and my children go to public schools. They're the only black family in public school. No one knocked on our door and welcomed us and said, "Hey, we're here." And mind you, out in the country, I don't think people do that. I don't think that's part of the practice out there. They're very, they stay to themselves and such. But I often wondered, what if I moved to an upper class white neighborhood that's more, in the suburbs or whatnot, or in closer to the city? Would I ever, had an approach of welcome to the neighborhood and such? Now, I don't tend to think so black and white often. In fact, rarely do I think so black and white. But I felt like, perhaps it is because that now we're sort of like a threat to the existence of what people know.
Mhm.
And if you don't grow up with that understanding of be open, be welcoming, explore, and try to reach out and connect. If you don't grow up with that understanding, why do we think adults are going to have that? If parents aren't teaching that, if the system and school systems aren't teaching that and fostering that, why would the adult now have that? Because what? They read books that bring them to that light? Well, why would they even, attract to those books? What would make them? And because I live in the country now and I get to acutely observe how lots of white people live together, essentially, right? I get to understand more of the they're not a monolith by any sense, but more of the cultural references and connections between this group of people, and how they communicate, the ways they support each other, and so on and so forth. And I've come to understand that some communities, outreach and being very communal, it's very natural to them, right? For example, families living with their grandparents and their cousins as well, and so on and so forth. For many communities around the world, that is what life is. And then, but I've seen here in Canada, life is, for at least for European settlers and stuff, it's not so much similar and the same. And again, not to make it about black and white and such, but that's kind of what it's up against. We're up against a colonial system that's been set up here, essentially, that has created over time these things that have become systemic, and it's going to take different ways of thinking about them to break them down. So outreach on that other side needs to be open, create awareness. There's got to be more programs, because sometimes people just won't do it on their own. PSAs, whatever it takes to get that idea of let us meet at that nexus, is where we're gonna create some harmony.
Let me ask you now about the third point that you mentioned. You talked about discrimination. And I don't think we need to identify what that is. I think we all know what that is and what it could become. And it's kind of more moderated, indirect, overt and covert ways.
Right.
Let me ask you about this question from another angle, which is, you've been here for a long time. You've traveled, come back. Do you feel like, with all of the efforts and all the energy and all the programs and money thrown at these issues of
Yeah.
discrimination, in all of its manifestations,
Mhm.
to what extent do you feel like the youth of today are still struggling with this? Is this something that you get from them, that they feel that there are prejudices working against them,
Mhm.
biases working against them, they're discriminated against, or is this a problem that's kind of going away? How bad is it today compared to what you were perhaps seeing or experiencing or living a
Right.
few decades ago, let's say a couple of decades ago?
Well, before I jump into that, it just crossed my mind that my responses are all connected to, when I talk about communities and such, I want the listeners to know it's about youth and how youth connect or relate to these issues.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
but specifically in this one with discrimination, so discrimination is, it's a real thing, and it's perpetuated in so many different ways. Discrimination, of course. I grew up very aware and of discrimination, but it was only until I came to Canada, and it was really, really only until, actually, I faced different forms of discrimination, but the first time I felt that whip of discrimination was when living in the projects where I grew up. I walked across the lawn of my neighbor's home. He wasn't my direct neighbor, a few homes down. And this lawn is a decrepit lawn. It wasn't well taken care of. He had a dog, and the dog would ravish the grass. And these lawns were about the size of this table. In the projects, that's the lawn. And it's not your lawn, it's Ottawa Community Housing's lawn. But regardless, it's on their address. And I walked across his lawn, and this species. It's a lawn you probably don't even want to walk across. But for some reason, as a child, I was probably 9 years old. I ran across his lawn. He opened the window and he said, "Get off my lawn, nigger!" And he yelled it to me really loud. And prior to that, I didn't know what that word was. Prior to that, I knew about discrimination and racism,
Mhm.
essentially, but I didn't know that word. I was 9, and I didn't. No one had ever said that word to me. While I may have heard it maybe in a song or something, it just didn't register as a thing. I was too young to understand the context, right? But when he said that to me and he yelled it to me, there was such aggression, and the way he ended it with the N word, that I knew that there was something really, really negative about this experience. So I went home and I told my dad. My dad gave me the race talk. And then it was in grade 7, and then from that point, there were other instances in that neighborhood that, I experienced racism at that level and
Mhm.
discrimination essentially, right? With racism is a form of course, discrimination. So, there was a time in, grade 7, I bumped into my, woodworking/tech design teacher,
Mhm.
and he was a burly, short man. I didn't know at the time, but he's Lebanese. He had olive skin tone, and for me, being grade 7, I just didn't know the world enough to know that from this part of the world, you can get this really rich olive skin tone. So I remember him, and I did like the way he just presented himself. He was rough around the edges, but I remember in the hallway, I bumped into him by accident, and he turned around to me and he said, "Get your cotton picking hands off me." And I didn't know what that meant. So, but I remember the rage in his voice. And I
Mhm.
went home. Apologized to him. I said, "Sorry. I guess we were both looking different ways." I went home to my dad and he gave me the race talk again. And talking about what the context of that term means, your cotton picking hands.
Mhm.
And so my dad started to open up to me about certain things. One, that he had worked with the Black Panther Party, in his university days in New York City, and told me about his experience with that and just the work that he did. And it brought me to awareness about the idea of discrimination and its roots,
Mhm.
where it comes from, of course. So fear, right? Ignorance, arrogance. The arrogance is from the perpetuation of it by ourselves, or people who use divide and conquer as a way to keep people in control, essentially, right? And there are this is not conspiracy. This is what civilization has used since
This
time.
is human history.
It's human history. You don't have to think divide and conquer. Is that no? It happens over and over again. It just manifests itself in different ways, right? Through time. So, there's that aspect, but of course, being fearful of the unknown is common. And so I sometimes do like to go back to understanding psychology, understanding even how children develop and understand the world, even if they were in the most perfect of settings. So if you took a child, a young infant, and you placed them in a perfect ambient environmental setting in a bubble, you know that there would be problems that would arise even in that perfect bubble. Even if the child had all the food, all the nutrients, was well maintained, if they were warm, didn't get too extreme colds, even if they had things to engage their intelligence,
Mhm.
trouble would arise, even without even another human being there, right? There would be conflict that would arise in that bubble. It's a scientific fact, right? It's a study that has been done, right? So you can imagine in a world of 7 billion people, there, all of us trying to understand our own bubble and how we perceive the world, amalgamate with the rest of the world, right? And then allow that amalgamation to also grow and develop ourselves. That's a constant, although it's natural to us, it's not always perfect.
Mhm.
And so I going back to the roots, discrimination presents itself as a fear of the unknown and not understanding the techniques and the steps to become less fearful of that which you do not know.
Mhm.
It's not a linear process by any means, and it hasn't been written in any tablet that people follow in a sense, and it presents itself at working every time. So when it comes to discrimination, what the work that we have to do as a community, let's say, that has children or youth that are discriminated against because of being first generation, because of their spiritual practice, because of the color of their skin,
Mhm.
because of their gender and identities and such. When you have those youth that are that belong in those categories, or that identify, I should say, with those categories, one of the things that I feel we should be doing, in order to enhance the experience, is bring them into spaces from an early age that give them an opportunity to be exposed, and those people naturally to be exposed to them.
Mhm.
Have your children volunteer the moment you arrive. Create volunteer programs for immigrants, and volunteer programs for the full family. So it's a full family experience on farms. So let's say there are, a lot of the farmers out here are white owned farms. If those farmers can say, we have summer,
Mhm.
2-week programs where immigrant families can come and work, come
Mhm.
on. Think about,
Yeah,
how you
the
break them.
benefits.
Think
Yeah,
about
two
the
way.
benefits.
Yeah.
It's both ways, right? Well, I don't know if there might be something that exists like that, but imagine if the government said, we will give farmers incentives, it provided incentives so that immigrants or newcomers here, people with different languages, different skin tones, different religious and perspectives, or, even just escaping trauma and such, right? And violence, when they arrive, the people that would probably have the most what's it called, the most apprehension, the people who've lived here,
Mhm.
been here, all settlers, mind you,
Yes,
but right,
yes.
they will be able to now have incentives, bring families in. And I know there's other programs that are not on farms, but I say farms because most farms owned by white families that have had it for a generation or two in their lives, right? So programs like that don't exist, which means we are perpetuating the things that we as humanity are building that don't serve us well. Right. So it's, we have to start tackling from a origin standpoint, the things that we create
Mhm.
on our own, the fear, the ignorance, right? And then working against that, right? And also understanding, not just working against it, because you don't want to be responsive, you want to be preventative, right? So, again, we have this structure set up where we love to have immigrants because it boosts our economy, but we don't have much going on to help with that integration, or it's not institutional yet. It's not common. It's not, in everybody should know that in Ottawa, you and I, a person who's been there, who has family members here for the last 40, 50, years, we should all know of that center, that
Mhm.
institution. We say it by name. We should know what street it's on.
Mhm. Mhm.
That helps, immigrant and newcomer families and youth specifically integrate, learn, and be exposed and aware. So I say, bring the children to volunteer, right? Or on the other side, have volunteer programs that you offer if you've been here for a long time. And not only people who've been here who aren't look that don't look like us, our communities too who've been here before us. So if you're a Lebanese family, you're coming here, the Lebanese community should be thinking about, how do we set up a program that helps new coming Lebanese build entrepreneurship skills, right? Find them connections to volunteer, find them connections to take English as a second language, maybe outside of school. And I'm sure there's great communities, strong communities that have thought that and put some things into effect.
Mhm. Mhm.
But again, we should know it by name.
Yeah.
We should be able to have the business card and say, that's where it is, that's their website. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're still trying to figure out, we're still trying to just figure out, and it's not preventative, unfortunately. It's just responsive, and
Mhm.
it's not the
Mhm.
best way to go about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. There's a couple of things that you mentioned a few times. I think it would be very interesting to go back to them. One of them is the importance you're giving to psychology and the linkages I'm making as you're talking between, the importance of mental health, basically, as you talked about, basically all 3 points that you mentioned with the identity and belonging. Certainly with the discrimination and my mind goes to how do we build up that resiliency,
Mm,
how are the youth experiencing all of this, and even for the outreach. But to me those two really stand out, the sense of belonging, and if it's not well taken care of,
mhm,
then what are the dangers there from a mental health perspective, because I think you've done work and studies in that way,
mm.
and so I think you see it right away, as well as discrimination. So you keep going back to the psychological aspect. Is this something that you've kind of encountered directly, or just a logical conclusion that you're referring to?
No, so mental health is one of the things that I've paid a lot of attention to in my time. And there's so much to unpack when it comes to it, because it's not an exact science yet, and we're constantly learning about the brain. The brain is the most powerful engine in the world, in the universe. According to human beings, we don't know anything more complex and powerful than the human brain. It's how we understand everything else at the end of the day. So mental health is one of those things I pay attention to, specifically because on both sides of my family, my mom and father's side, there are individuals who've experienced extreme mental health issues. My mother being one of them, my late mother being one of them, and just sitting back as a child and observing, asking myself the why question, right?
Hmm.
Why is this person going through this? And what makes a person either get better from mental health issues or not?
Hmm.
It pushed me into trying to understand psychology a bit more, and the way that external factors trigger mental health, and the way that internal, like DNA and
Hmm.
heredity, can trigger mental health issues as well. And one of the things that I've realized, especially within youth, there are some things that trigger mental health, of course, like trauma, right? And now there's studies out that are prominent studies that are talking about intergeneration. excuse me, excuse me,
Yeah, the intergenerational issues, right? Between
excuse
the youth and
me.
their parents.
That's right,
Yeah.
intergenerational trauma, right? That is passed down, but even trauma that is passed down through genetic and through the DNA, right? I can't. It's kind of like basically your ancestors. The trauma, it can be stored in their DNA.
Yeah,
That
it's
the effects
hereditary. Yeah.
exactly right, and so. That being the case, when it comes to in mental health, sometimes it can be present itself through very limited stimulation. It doesn't take much for it to present itself in someone, and other times it's going to be something traumatic like war that you've experienced, abuse, violence, essentially anything that goes against the natural balance of what human beings should be experiencing. And what happens is when you arrive in environments that are already hostile towards you, or you've spent your life in survival mode, or a portion of your life in survival mode, right? And that becomes your common what's it called? Your common response
Yeah.
to
By
external fact.
default, you go
Your
there.
default. Thank you very much. When it becomes a default behavioral pattern, that in and of itself can now start putting stressors on the brain, and we all know that behavior patterns, a large majority of it relies on our hormones and the hormonal functions, right? If the hormones are in balance, you yourself will present yourself as in balance, not just physically, but from an intellectual standpoint, so on and so forth. And so that's what ends up happening in most cases, that people arrive in environments that either are hostile or they're leaving hostility, and it's still part of their function. And, mental health issues are higher in those communities or in
Mhm,
those
mhm,
groups, right?
mhm.
And so again, I think we're not looking at it from that standpoint. There are sensitivities there, and if we're not creating a society that is sensitive to these things, and again, especially a society that relies and depends on having newcomers, having people of different backgrounds. Canada cannot say it would be where it's at if we don't live by that standard, right? Being a multicultural melting pot, essentially. So, but we're not sensitive to the understanding that you cannot just have people coming from war torn countries, escaping poverty, extreme poverty, and not having a full fledged system available that looks at those different sensitivities. Because then you're going to have communities coming here, and now you have to support them using tax dollars, even more tax dollars, because their mental health is such in their families that they
Mhm.
can't get out of poverty,
Yeah.
right? They stay in communities that are low income, and nobody wants to stay in an income that's low income, yeah, in a neighborhood that's low income.
Mhm.
If you had a choice, you would go higher. But then if you have a parent who has a mental health issue because they're going through psychic trauma, right? You have to now become the one of the breadwinners of the home, and so on and so forth, and it continues to perpetuate itself. So mental health is huge, not just when it goes bad, but what's happening when it's going good. What are we doing if we have good mental health?
Mhm.
What are we doing to create opportunities or to create initiatives for those who don't have good mental health? Right? It should become almost like a duty, right? You know how some countries you got to go to war, into the army for a year or two.
Mhm.
Should be our duty to be able to create like have a sensitivity package, so we can understand how to create less hostile environments for people who are coming escaping hostility, or who will just face it here because of discriminatory practices.
The other thing that I picked up on as you were talking, and you mentioned it a few times, um, is that you mentioned running into these, I'm going to call them traumatic or very novel situations for
Right,
you.
right.
And, but you had someone to turn to. You
Mhm,
had, I don't know if this is, the relationship you had with your dad,
mhm,
that, you saw him as the mentor or the strong father figure or not.
mhm,
But to me, every time you mentioned one of those situations, you mentioned a few of them, you
mhm,
had someone to turn to, you relied on them, they gave you advice,
mhm.
and you left equipped with something
Right.
to better deal with it, and it builds. And is this something now that you are witnessing and seeing as lacking in our communities? This strong, mentor figure, someone you look up to, you know where to turn if you have issues. Do you feel like the youth have these role models in their lives and in their communities, that the ones you're exposed to,
Yeah.
uh, or is that lacking? And what do we need to do to move in that direction to fix that, or help remedy that?
That's a great question. We are definitely lacking, and it's because what happens is, I have an older brother, and my older brother, he spent 8 years in prison, in a maximum security prison. And when he went to prison, I know I now became the oldest, male child in the home. I had an older sister,
Mm,
but she wasn't at home. She was living on her own, and so I took on a lot of responsibility. And although my father was an excellent teacher and mentor for me, my father was dealing with some really difficult struggles. Again, being a new generation immigrant, and he was here for a long time, mind you, settled in Toronto and Canada for since he was late teens, but that identity thing, it doesn't dissolve just like that, right? Sometimes it takes years, and even then he's a dark skinned man. He stands out wherever he goes, let's put it that way, and his boldness and such. So my father, I didn't I would have wished I had someone beside my father as well too, because my father's also a disciplinary. And so he's also the person that, will scold me if I'm doing wrong. So
mhm.
it's not like I'm always running to my dad. And I
Yeah.
think that's what happens with a lot of the youth that are within these marginalized communities. Their only source of mentorship, maybe their parents, but your parents are also your coach, your teacher. They'll tuck you in, but they'll scold you too, if you're misbehaving and such. So it doesn't, you always want that uncle. Of course, hopefully the
Mhm,
uncle's a safe and person that you enjoy being around. You want that uncle where it's like you'll tell your uncle some things, but you won't tell your parents some
mhm.
things,
Or your
right?
older brother, or that
Or an older
close
sibling and
friend,
such,
or
right?
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Now some people have that great relationship, they could tell their parents everything, but in common cases, there's some things you don't want to approach your parents about, right? You want to have an ear that's going to be less judgmental. And trust me, with 6 children, my kids are probably sick of me right, speaking to them. And but I know the value, right, of having someone else. I didn't have anybody else.
Mhm,
My peers were my peers, let's just put it that way. They weren't the ones I knew that these aren't the ones that I want to take advice from, life advice from,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And then educators or anybody in figures of authority, they often go back to representation. They cannot connect with my story, so I felt in a sense that I would be, speaking to someone and go through one ear, come out the other. But if I had someone who was there that knew my struggle,
mhm,
perhaps that was grew up in, and that were like maybe 10-year gap, grew up and was here already before me or whatnot, and navigated it already, but not like to their point where they're an OG, meaning they're an old man, telling stories about when they used to walk 10 miles to go to school,
yeah.
but to the point where they can still relate and they still kind of have one foot in, one foot out. Our parents don't have one foot in; they have 2 feet in the struggle. That's what
Mhm,
they have, right? They don't sometimes they don't have that one foot in. I still got that struggle that I'm dealing with being a newcomer. One foot out's like, but I'm going to university or maybe getting my degrees again, because I want to make sure that's on record. A lot of people come here with degrees. Don't get it twisted, right? But others outside of that, with that one foot, if you can talk to someone who has one foot in, one foot out, you get the duality. And in life, with you can't just know one side and not know the other. In fact, true understanding means you got to know both sides. At some point, you got to know what the other side of the coin is, right? And so, I think when it comes to the topic of what we're discussing here,
Role
this is
models,
role models and
mentors.
mentors. That's
Yeah.
right. For role models and mentors, programs. We all know there's mentorship programs, but we need funding. We need to put money in. Mentorship should not be a mentor should be paid for what they do, because this is in-depth work you're doing, right? And I've been approached. I'm an artistic mentor, and I'm an arts coach and such. So I do a lot of mentorship. Right now I have 11, sorry, of organizations I'm mentoring, and then a bunch of individual artists. And what I realize is sometimes like an organization or an entity might come to me and say, "Hey, can you do this mentorship?" And I want to, but they want me to do it for free and commit to 3 years and see and support these people into fruition, for like 3 days a week.
Mhm.
I said, I don't know what you think this is, but one, we're in Canada. We create social programs here that nurture the community. It shouldn't come out of my pocket. It shouldn't be I'm driving using my gas. And trust me, my passion is in mentoring. And I do 2 free mentorships every month. So I take on 2 new clients that are free. That's part of my quota so that I'm giving back. But a lot of people are reticent to do that deep mentorship work because it's being asked to be done for free.
Mhm.
We're talking deep work, right? Working with an individual so that they can find value and they could understand how to navigate this space better and create meaningful citizenship in this country. That's deep work. That's not beginner level work.
Mhm.
Find the funding to pay individuals to do that, and I guarantee it'll boost the experience, and we'll have more opportunities for mentorship. But right now, we know that as great as Canada is, our country doesn't prioritize certain things. It's not prioritizing it as essential needs, right? Look at Ontario; they just cut more money to education and funding. They decided let's take more money from education in this time of crisis. They're pulling back on this teacher support. And what else are they doing? The COVID cleaning. They're just pulling back on how they're, managing COVID within the education system, cutting the funding. That makes no sense. We're really trying to move forward and heal, look at the things that are wrong and, correct them in a sense. We have to get down to the roots of the socio-psychological, connections
Mhm.
between these things.
Do you feel like in the communities, the minority communities themselves, the Muslim communities that you know, do you feel like there's enough awareness about this issue of, perhaps, or is there not even enough awareness because the youth don't know what they don't know, right?
Right.
So, uh, is there anyone steering them in that direction? This was a beautiful reflex that you had to
Mm.
say, but this is with hindsight.
Yeah.
Were you actually feeling that growing up? I wish I had, that person besides my father. I want someone who has the wisdom and the experience and the judgment, but not my father because that's not my relationship with him and he doesn't get my entire reality,
Right.
right? Because I'm going through stuff he didn't go through.
Right.
But
Right.
it can't be these friends either because they may be lacking that experience and wisdom that I'm looking for.
Right. Right.
So maybe the youth are not the ones who are realizing this themselves.
Right.
Do you feel like the communities at least are aware that this is something that needs to be put in place? Because to me, that this is where there's something between you as the individual
Mhm.
putting this individual initiative in place,
Mhm.
and then we have the government and they do what they do.
Mhm.
uh, and as you said, depending on the government and the platform of the day and what's going on, who knows.
Mhm.
But then there's the actual communities and community organizations. And do you feel there's enough awareness and enough being done there, or is there more required at this level?
I definitely think that we're not doing enough, and it makes me think of cultural practices. What we pay attention to, and what we work as we pay attention to it, we actually engage with it. That will become our cultural practice, right? Whether it's a specific one to an individual, or if it's connected to a collective. And we don't create awareness around the importance of mentorship, but which cultural practices that come from? Because I was sitting with an Inuk individual about 2 weeks ago, and she was telling me about in her cultural practice when some of the youth become teens,
Mhm.
they now take on a group of younger children, and those children call that person like a name, like as if it's uncle, and they have now responsibility to like share skills and teach. So now, my I told my teen son who's 17 this. I'm like, if you ever complain about like helping out with these 7 children, in Inuit community, once you hit a certain age in your teenagedom, you are now responsible for children, not just in your family, but different children of different families,
Yeah.
right? And you're as responsible for caring and showing and teaching and nurturing. It's not just the parents. Very communal, right? So when I think about the awareness factor, I think it comes down to it's because it's not a embedded cultural practice for
Right.
us here to recognize that the importance of other community members stepping in and supporting, especially those that can relate to the stories of the youth, that can relate and so essentially close in age or have been through those things. It hasn't become a common community practice for us. We don't even understand it as important. So there's no way we'd have any awareness around the vital or the necessity of something like that until you're older and you realize, oh, mentorship is a real thing.
Hmm.
Oh, I do wish. So for me, yeah, when I was young, I never thought, wish there was someone here to talk to me. But as I started to be step into that role,
Yeah.
and people have told me how important it is, I realized, man, like if me myself and I'm speaking to all these people and doing my best to try to help them and show them and guide them, then imagine if like there was structural, programs, and like as you said, more awareness around the necessity of this and the importance, how much change can happen.
Hmm.
And I think, again, it's a if it doesn't become part of our cultural practice, we won't pay attention to it, and it'll continue to be something that we just ignore, but yet it festers and creates, harm and difficulties in communities.
Let me switch to something a little bit more personal.
Right.
I'm very curious about this one, and we haven't talked about it. You're a poet. You're someone who has a passion for the language,
Yeah.
and I want to make a link between that and whether, in all this work that you do and your interactions with the youth, the importance of the medium, the importance of the message, and how it's communicated, and to what extent do you feel like we are aware of this, we're using that, and what do you do with it? How is there some sort of the way you use the language and you use the medium that you have and talent that you have, is there some kind of activist dimension to it in your heart that you feel you are doing work and this is how you're doing it,
Yes.
or is that compartmentalized in your mind? There's this and this is what I'm doing and there's that, and then to me, I want to build on that to start moving towards the message to the youth from all of this.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, I compartmentalize some things as an arts practitioner. Um, uh, Personally, I compartmentalize my own understanding and belief of how I practice my art, and my own, just my own understanding of how the messages that I create and how I practice my art. Because in my community, it can be a topic of conflict, how I practice my art. So I compartmentalize that because I know that I am not here to create more dissonance and be what's a polarizing figure.
Hmm.
I'm
Hmm.
actually wanting to use my art as a way to unite people. And so, getting to your question, for me, my art is activist based,
Hmm.
absolutely, and even for my children. So, in my home, my children, when they ask me to listen to music and such, say, "Yeah, listen to music," but if the message is poisonous,
Hmm.
right? Meaning that it insinuates or it perpetuates, poisonous behavior, things that aren't
That's
harmful for
toxic for
people,
your mind,
that's
for your
toxic for your
heart.
thoughts
Yeah.
and such.
Yeah.
Don't play it. That's not, that energy is not welcome in this home, right? Or play it on your own time. But I try to teach them the value of being aware of what you consume. It's not just what you put in your mouth. You know what I mean? What you consume is what you consume through all your senses. So there's that. And but at the same time, I have to be a model, a role model to that. I can't be out here now telling my children, be careful of what you consume, but I can't be out here just
Hmm.
putting out
Hmm.
messages, right?
Walking the
That
walk. Yeah.
exactly, I have to walk the walk, especially as a father, right? And as arts mentor and coach. So, some people have asked me, Jamal, why don't you just make our music or poetry like everybody else does and you'll get famous and such? And I've actually had opportunities to do that. I've been asked and requested by an artist, some which I can't name, to write songs for them, to create artistic ideas for them. And I've passed because my moral compass and my ethics says my community doesn't need me as
Hmm.
a person who is looked up to as a leader, continuing to tell those stories through my art. I need to tell stories that demonstrate, moving from tragedy to triumph. And that's an old that's that in fact is an old storytelling trope. It's existed in cultures and communities.
Hmm.
It's always the underdog
That's the
comes
arc.
up.
Yes.
Exactly,
That's
that's the
yeah.
arc, right? And so I use that style of delivery, but reflect on my own experiences. Sometimes I reflect on experiences of others to tell my story through music art. I specifically pay attention to people of color and immigrants and indigenous people's stories, and I don't only tell my story as a black Muslim person and the things that I faced or the things that I desire. I sometimes want to not reinterpret, but I want to amplify the stories of others through my poetry or art as well. And I think that's really important for me to use my platforms in that way, because one, I have children, but two, I can't. I want to fill the gaps. I want to fill those gaps where I know that if I'm not a prime minister, if I'm not, city councilor or such, I'm not in those positions. So what can I do with the
Mhm.
position that I have, right, to fill those gaps? Especially because I'm still so closely related to people who are homeless. I know people in my community who are homeless, who have drug addiction, right? Who and I'm talking young people. Again, this is again related to youth. I know youth, right, between the ages of 17. I've had youth call me who are about to commit suicide on the phone, and I'm at my job. I have to talk them through those experiences. Then I gotta either go home and figure out how to, like, filter those experiences so it doesn't manifest itself in my family and such, right?
Mhm.
I'm so closely connected to it. I would be remiss to not now use that as a way, as a in my art, as a potential way to create healing and progress.
There is something in there, I think, that's very personal. So I'm not going to ask about that. I'm going to ask more about as a medium. To what extent do you feel that that works? So you're using this art to deliver certain messages. You talked about, for instance, creating unity. You spoke about harmony earlier, and I think these are kind of your lofty ideals and values, and you work towards them, and you put that in everything in your life, including your art. To what extent do you feel that it works? And to me, do you see the difference, or do you see how effective it is to do it that way, as opposed to just coming and saying it directly to someone? So going through the art way, with all the work and all the hours and effort that requires, does it actually work? Do you feel that it's a successful means that, obviously, my next question would be, that we should be promoting and pushing more youth into, because it is effective? Or is it more just, for you, it's a therapeutic thing, almost like, it's your own spiritual personal journey,
Right.
and that's fine. But how effective is it to move in those directions?
Well, the efficacy of it all is not it's not the whole package. So art as a revolution, art is a universal language. Animals even create art. There's this bird, I think, or this underwater creature that does this pattern at the bottom of the water, and it attracts another, the similar creature and such, right? So art is a constant universal language.
Yeah.
It's quite effective, but it can't be the only thing. So when I do arts education or arts mentorship and coaching, it's not the only strategy that I'm weaving into this mentorship process.
Mm.
I'm also using creating what's social skills, right, and understanding. I'm also creating critical thinking skills. That word resilience.
Mhm.
I'm trying to get them to learn resilience, but it's all through the medium of art because it's a universal language. Art really is one of those things where it can bridge gaps, right? We have think of Bob Marley. Bob Marley as the famous storyteller he is, right? Of course, died very young, but with Bob Marley, the stories that he told as a black man from Jamaica, with looking different with dreadlocks, and how those stories, if you read the lyrics of Bob Marley's stories, they're incredibly healing, incredibly unifying. And he actually was able to unify people of different backgrounds through that, using that medium. And so but it's not the only thing. Bob Marley stood on stage and was shot, right? And then for speaking up about the factions in the Jamaican politics. And then the next day he came back on stage after being shot and did a concert to bring those political parties together. And so art as a revolution it's powerful, but it can't be the only thing. We have to look at other segments and pockets of society and what they're doing as well. It can't just rely on the artists, because we already know that in the grand scheme of things, the money is what makes things move, unfortunately. And in the mainstream, I don't want to tell youth that I work with. So for example, I know phenomenal. There's some viral youth in Ottawa that I've had a chance to mentor. They're viral. If it wasn't the pandemic, they might be living in France or something, right? And but I don't when I work with them, I don't tell them to just do art alone. I say, your bag has to have more than that. What do
More
you know?
tricks,
More
yeah.
tricks. What do you know about business, right? What do you know about creating business for yourself? Because the entertainment world is cruel, and it's relentless in how it controls its population. And I know the truth of this, so I don't only push that idea that use art and be expressive. it's a lot more than that. You have to understand what you're up against, but you also have to understand if you're trying to make a difference, art can it's sometimes it requires more than that. So the language of art is effective, but understand other languages. When you create, it's kind of like LeBron James. You know, if you got more skills in your trick, you're harder to stop coming to the basket, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of take that stance. I don't want to just teach people how to write effective poetry, how to use poetry and rap. I want to show them how art can change your life. It can change your story like it did for mine, from being the one that no one gave a chance to the one that he creates chances for others now, or they create chances for others.
You've gone through so much, and I think you've done so much too. Uh, going back to, as you said, being born and starting your life in Toronto, traveling, coming back, and everything that we talked about. If you had one message that we can end on, that you are directly delivering to the youth, especially those that are struggling, and especially those that are going through some of the challenges and some of the worst that you mentioned, what would it be from someone who has actually gone through all of this and has been directly exposed to a lot of this? As you said, a minority within a minority, an immigrant. Uh, what would you say to the youth?
I've been asked this question before. It's one that I always feel I don't answer adequately because I could probably talk about it for a while. There's many things to say to young people. I feel like for young people, I'm trying to take myself back to when, because I dropped out of high school and I was homeless for 2 years. And I'm trying to think about like that extreme loneliness or feeling like my life wasn't worth it, you know. And I went through that for quite a while. And even when I got married and such and had companionship, that feeling was still there for me to
Mhm.
cope, to try to deal with and work through, of feeling worthless. And I feel like this is what I want to tell young people this time. So lean into your communities. Lean into your communities. I know that it's hard because oftentimes your community might be elders, or there's a lot of cultural pressure, traditionalistic pressure, ideals that are placed on your shoulders to carry. But in leaning into your community, be vulnerable and express and be open. Speak to your community members in a way that lets them know what hurts, what's
Mhm.
hard, what's challenging, so that your community can now be at least more aware of those difficulties. At the end of the day, especially when you're dealing with a community of elders, they are not experiencing the world as you are, and vice versa. And so, speaking, like as a poet, that's what I do. Speaking your truth to your community, not with angst or spitefulness, or as if you're trying to challenge them, but just leaning in and speaking your truth and saying, hey, like it's not as easy as you think. Yes, you went through some hard times, but what I have to try to figure out is also difficult too. And I think the thing about it is, young people are afraid. They're intimidated by leaning into their community because
Mhm.
they're afraid that they're going to be judged, right? Criticized. They won't be held and feel safe. And at the end of the day, when you look at child development, young people are going through complex transitions,
Mhm.
from a physiological standpoint and a mental standpoint. So it would be unfair for me to say a message to the youth and not say a message to the communities that are supposed to be nurturing the youth. We have to be receptive to the young people's situations and plight, even if it seems foreign. And sometimes you're like, that's nothing. If it might seem insignificant, we can't treat it as such, right? What's insignificant to someone living in one part of the world is not to someone in another part of the world. And when you think about it, that's what life experience is. People have their own views on the world and how
Mhm.
they navigate it and come into, their full being, essentially, right? And there's different journeys and paths, and we all blossom in different seasons. So you can't really, again, it's not something that's refined to a perfect science. So there's both sides. If I'm going to tell the youth to lean in, and I say that because I know that the community really just wants good for the young people. We do, but we're not experts. right? We might have an expert in construction or engineering, but we're not experts in being, the person that's going to elevate and alleviate all of someone else's circumstances. So lean in. And then on the other side of it, of course, we hope that the community members listen and find a way to support the young people as much as possible.
That is, I think, a beautiful message to end on. Thank you so much for your openness, for the intimate, insightful things that you shared with us. I think we covered a lot of the issues at the core, direct experience and professional experience and other. To me, it was very, very worthwhile to go through all of this. Very, very valuable. So I hope you enjoyed your time here as much as we enjoyed
It
having you.
was great, great time, great time. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And dear viewers, hope to see you and hear you and have you with us once again in another episode of Muslim Youth Matters. And thank you all. And may God bless and peace.
Thank you.
Thanks.